They're empowered and they're innovating. Patients today no doubt have access to more information than ever before when it comes to their own health data. We are also inundated with medical information online regarding providers, treatments, medications, and conditions, and whatever else Dr. Google tells us. For the last 2 days, we've been talking about the impact of these tremendous new technologies across the healthcare system. Now we're going to look at how this trickles down into the hands of patients who may have both rare and more commonplace conditions, and how they are increasingly able to take charge of their own health destiny. Joining us to share some very personal stories of patients leveraging the information and making a difference in their own care, please welcome to the stage Deborah Brooks, Kathy Giusti, Sean Lane, Claudia Williams, along with our moderator and my first boss at Fortune magazine, McKinsey's Rick Kirkland.
Thank you, Adam. All right, we are indeed going to spend the next 35 minutes talking about, or 30 minutes, I guess, according to the clock, talking about the growing power of the patient as an innovator. And to do that, we have 4 leaders of this burgeoning revolution. I'll introduce them briefly. Deborah Brooks is a former investment banker who, in 2000, along with actor Michael J. Fox, co-founded the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research, and still serves there as executive vice chairman. Kathy Giusti is a patient who turned institution builder, created the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, and has a new hat she's wearing as, I think it's co-chair of the Harvard Business School Kraft Precision Medicine Accelerator.
You
got that right?
Yes.
All right. Sean Lane is a serial entrepreneur whose current venture, Crosschecks, is attempting to come up with some novel answers to address something we've been talking about a lot, which is how do you get your information out and translate it in this sort of electronic Tower of Babel we've created in the healthcare system. And last but not least, Claudia Williams is here from the government. She's here to help us. She is, let me get your title right, Claudia. Senior Advisor for Health Technology and Innovation at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And she also helps lead something we've been talking about a lot, the Precision Medicine Initiative the President has launched. So welcome. Debbie, let me start with you. There's a lot of ground to cover. Just give us a little bit of a brief kind of update on what you've been achieving at the Michael J. Fox Foundation, and most important, I guess, what's the sort of big idea behind what you guys have been doing?
Sure, thanks. You know, we've been at it about 16 years. I think when we first started, we thought we'd be raising money and funding science, and we quickly realized that that was not only inadequate, but it didn't really speak to what the patients were looking for. And being founded by a patient in Michael, and being substantially funded by patients and families that care about Parkinson's disease, we really very quickly redefined what our agenda was going to be. And so we are using patient capital to de-risk Parkinson's drug development. And so I think some of the biggest, the big idea at the core of that is that the patient can be a peer in the process of getting to better treatments. And I think that goes across how patients are engaging today in improving their care, getting to the right doctors, which in Parkinson's is a challenge, and playing a role in both funding research and participating in research. So, you know, it's a revolution and an evolution, and we see groups like ours and a few others kind of who've been at it a little bit longer, really showing other disease indications how the patient community can be playing a critical role in making progress faster.
And you've actually pushed the development of a number of drug treatments, right? I mean, what was the enabling thing behind that?
Money.
Money always helps.
Well, I think first of all, we're never going to, Michael has a saying, the government's going to throw more money at this by accident than we can throw it on purpose, although shockingly over time, we're getting closer and closer to putting the amount of money to work each year from our organization that the government does in Parkinson's, which is actually, I'd like to see the government do more. But what we're trying to do is really go into that valley of death area, so bring more things out of basic science, take risks in converting these and getting them on the path towards drug development. And we thought at the beginning, if we could get something to phase 1, we'd be done. We find now we play a role well into phase 2, and then also a lot of work in kind of improving the odds of any new therapeutic areas, and particularly in the genetics, which have been emerging for Parkinson's, in looking for biomarkers, helping with clinical trial recruitment. And so we become the problem solvers, really, and have the long view in the field, and can think about not only chaperoning and funding really high-risk therapeutic ideas and getting some novel ideas in the pipeline, but also just making sure any of those ideas have a much higher chance of getting to the clinic and working with industry to kind of address the questions in their calculus that keep them thinking of Parkinson's as kind of a cuspy business decision. We'd like them to step in more to Parkinson's and help get some of these things over the goal line.
Yep. Kathleen, go to you. So sort of a similar playbook, I think, for MMRF, but you've also, at Harvard, you've been sort of thinking a bit about how do we keep pushing this forward? What's the next phase for this kind of patient advocacy?
Well, I think what we learned at the MMRF was when I started the organization back in 1998, we actually started around the same time, we realized that, myeloma, people were living 3 years, 100% fatal. Fast forward now, nearly 20 years, and in multiple myeloma, we have had 10 drugs approved. We've tripled the lifespan of our patients. And we've really, at the MMRF, developed what we call the precision medicine model. So what we decided to do was not fund research, but to actually do the research. And the hard part of that is raising the dollars that you need to actually create these models. So at the MMRF, we started by building our own tissue bank and data bank, where all the centers were contributing tissue in a very collaborative way and then driving data forward. And then we kept building on that data bank by doing genomic sequencing. The important piece of that then was making sure that data was going into the public domain where the whole world could share it and where that data could be analyzed, and then driving it to the clinic. So we've now conducted 70 phase 1 and 2 trials, and we have 20 trials ongoing as we speak right now, just making sure that we continue to see progress. So you would say to yourself, well, that's good enough. Patients are living 9 years now on average with myeloma as opposed to the 3 years when I was diagnosed. But we really have found it is about the data. So we built our COMPASS study, which I think many people in the room may be familiar with, but it's where we sequenced 1,000 patients from the moment of diagnosis, and we follow them all the way through their journey, 8 years, 9 years, and every time they relapse, we resequence them. Every time they go into a good remission, we actually check to see minimal residual disease, how is that all looking, and then all that COMPASS data set goes into the public domain where the whole world can share it too. But what we have found is 20% of patients in COMPASS have already died and never responded to treatment. So, we have a lot of things that we still have to do, figure out who are the high-risk patients, how can we work to get new drugs to those high-risk patients. And then I think also in the area of prevention, understanding who smolders before they go into active disease, and how do we follow those smoldering patients and figure out how we could even prevent patients from getting active myeloma. So a lot to do there. So I still wear the MMRF hat to kind of set vision and strategy, which is incredibly fun, because working in one cancer, you can do so much. But then I also work up at Harvard Business School under an endowment from Robert and Jonathan Kraft, which is specifically in the business of science, to take all of the best practices across the various cancers and make sure that we're all working together. Because I used to always give the academic centers, I admit it, a really hard time that they didn't share. But it's really hard, even when you're your own little island in a cancer, it's hard for us to share across cancers. And myeloma has targets with melanoma, and breast has targets with prostate, and we all have to start figuring this out and working together as well.
How do we get, we've been talking a lot about data sharing in the last 2 days. How do we get that to continue and accelerate? What's required? Is it a business model thing? Is it?
Well, I think people talked about it today, and I couldn't agree with all the comments that were made. You have to look at the ecosystem and say, who needs to see the data and why? So when we're putting our COMPASS data together, we understand that people in biotech and pharma want to know where the new targets are, right? So we provide that data to them, we work with them, we help them to understand high risk, we help them in clinical trial design, and we all work together in that space. And that's why in COMPASS, we did develop a pre-competitive consortium with pharma But now we're in a different situation. We have 10 drugs approved in myeloma, and in all honesty, we don't know how to use them. So now the next phase is looking at all the data from Compass, but also joining, collaborations with other people that have clinical data in myeloma and saying, how should we use those 10 drugs? My view on that is it's probably a pre-competitive consortium with the payers, because in all honesty, I'm not sure every myeloma patient in a complete remission needs to stay on maintenance therapy for years and years and years. And we don't want to, and the payers don't want us to. So can't we start figuring out where we use drugs in a much more efficient manner?
Yeah. Sean, let me go to you. We were just talking in the panel before this. I was thinking about Adam, what Adam said when he brought me on. It says it in our blurb for this panel, consumers increasingly have access to their data and control of it, and yet we've also heard that that's actually a lot bloody harder than it sounds, and it's not quite the story. So what are you working on that's going to help us address this problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I come at this from a little bit different background. I was an intelligence officer, spent most of my career at NSA dealing with truly enormous data. So we were getting in 200,000 rows of data every second, and this was in Iraq in the middle of a combat zone, very heterogeneous. So we talk about healthcare data being heterogeneous. It's actually kind of homogeneous compared to some of the stuff we were getting, especially HL7. Just because you have 3 different standards of HL7, that's pretty homogeneous. So I came at it different. After NSA, I started a defense company. We built intelligence software. After that, I started looking at healthcare mostly because my hometown, which is a small rural town in the middle of nowhere, southeastern Ohio, they were having a big problem with prescription drug abuse. And they asked me to come and see if we could do anything to help it. And being from the intelligence community, I thought there has to be something we can do from a technology perspective. So I started looking at the data, especially in my hometown health system. And very quickly, I discovered that there was no identity layer. There was no unique ID for every single patient. Names were wrong, socials were wrong, transposed. Data was not talking to each other. And I stood back immediately and said, healthcare does not have the internet. And if healthcare does not have the internet, and if they don't have, for the kind of nerds out there, it's like having local IP addresses inside your network or an intranet, but not a NAT to basically translate everything globally so we can actually share information. So that's what we're doing at Crosschecks. I started 4 years ago. From that point, I said we're going to build a global graph of identities. We're going to create one unique ID for every single patient. We're going to harvest all the data from the health systems. We're going to empower the patient by giving it to them. And so far, we're live in about 310 health systems, a few thousand locations. We have 62.5 million patients in our graph, where each one has one unique ID, and we have a mobile application where patients can enter in information about themselves. We find that the patient-generated information is oftentimes more important or at least more valuable to us than some of the data that sits inside the EHRs that may be some transactional data that was put in there 10 years ago. The information we're getting from the patient is pretty spectacular. Data about their family history, their allergies, their medications, their insurance information. And our whole idea is that if we have this IP address and this internet where we can actually share information about patients, and ever since I came into healthcare 4 years ago, every conference I've gone to, it's been the same conversation about sharing information and putting it together. And we just got to build it. I mean, I don't want to hear people talk about big data until 100 million patients have access to their information. Then we can say we do big data, in my opinion. So that's what we're building.
And small question as a patient. So do I have to remember my password to have access?
Yeah, well, so that's a very good question because passwords are powerful. I mean, think about when you log into an app, a mobile app. You use Google and you use Facebook. That's called OAuth. Well, OAuth is what's going to get us a billion-dollar industry of new developers building healthcare applications, because me as a user, as a patient, with all my data, I can log in with one account to 1,000 apps, and my data then flows into those apps. Now, as a software developer, I'm going to start building apps for healthcare because I have access to the data. So it's actually the password that's going to change a lot of what we do every day, because it'll bring the developers out of the woodworks, out of the garages and the basements, keeping them from developing the next dating app and get them to develop the next healthcare app, because there's actually access to data. So I think that's actually a very important point.
Yeah, and I believe you're going to tell me I can get it like my iPhone now, right, with my thumb?
In 90% of the hospitals that we work with, we authenticate the patient via a fingerprint biometric. We did a lot in biometrics in the intelligence community, as you can imagine. But the challenge was let's actually create a global biometric system where a patient can scan a fingerprint and match instantly to all of their records.
So Claudia, so there's a fair number of folks that have given their information through Parkinson's and through multiple myeloma, but it's still a pretty small universe. So you're going big scale with precision medicine. So tell us a little about the initiative, and then how does that connect to this theme of empowering patients?
And to build on things that Kathy Hudson shared yesterday here on stage. More than a decade ago, both President Obama and Francis Collins came forward with sort of a vision of advancing personalized medicine. Francis Collins threw a paper, the president, or who was then senator, threw a bill, but it wasn't the right time. And what we've done since January 2015, when this effort was announced, is essentially build a vision to scale a new model of medicine that is tailored to the individual, not just genomics, of course, but also behavior, lifestyle preferences. And at the core of that effort will be what I think of as Framingham for the 21st century. If you remember, Framingham study was really the core asset that created so much of what we know today about cardiovascular health and everything else. What would it look like if you built that for the 21st century? Well, it would look like you bringing together vastly more and different types of data. So EHR data, sequencing data, environmental data, wearables data, and things like that. The vision is that 1 million or more Americans will participate in that.
Where are you right now? How many have you got in?
We haven't launched the enrollment
You haven't launched yet, okay. So we're at zero.
We're at zero. But I want to say a word about the role of the participant. When we have had conversations with the president, he's been very clear that our goal is not to build a new thing, as awesome as that will be. And this new thing will be data that's accessible to any of the researchers and folks that want to use it. It'll be secure, but accessible to people to use. But our goal is to also attack the underlying frictions that make this work hard. Yeah. One of the frictions that we identified early on and that he dramatically reinforced is the innovative potential of individual human beings with their own data in their own hands. Mm-hmm. And I would like to lay out 3 places where we are both innovating on that, and I think there's an opportunity for others to innovate. One is, what if participating in a research study was as easy as connecting an API using an API in OAuth, right?
Absolutely. Sounds good.
So we see this in ResearchKit that now you can sign up for a research app, and we are working with 7 EHR vendors to enable the APIs that they're building to be a conduit for participation in research into the PMI. So that's one, making research participation as easy as connecting an API. Second, what better way to enable future uses of research than to put the data in the person's hands? But yet we know in most research studies you don't get any of your own data back. The national survey that was run by the NIH Foundation found that 80% of people surveyed would be motivated to participate in research. Now let's remember, 3% of cancer patients are in trials. 80% would be motivated if they could get their own data back. Last, we have an ethics of protection. It's the IRB, it's the common rule, and it's super important. What about an ethics? What about a manifesto of participation? So what if I said as a patient, I'm not signing up for your study unless you promise to abide by this manifesto? And here it could look like this. It could say, I want my results back, I want you to publish an open access journal, and I want you to release the identified data. So if we took this motivation, we still have to deal with like how to connect those pieces, but what if we had a manifesto of participation? Because nothing is more insulting to somebody who's spending their blood, sweat, and tears literally on research than to know it got siloed into an individual researcher's data bank. So I think we have an opportunity to use participants and patients as vectors for this kind of acceleration.
So I see you guys nodding. I'm going to remind the audience I'd love to go to questions in 2 seconds, but did you want to pick up?
Yeah, so
Kathy and then
I worked with Claudia on the PMI, and I have to say, I think what's fascinating about it is it's designed for healthy subjects, right? But what I love about it is it really did try to bring everybody in and say, well, what do we all need to learn about teaching patients to be participants? So a big piece of that was, how do we get the participants to be willing to share their data? And what we have found, to be honest with you, is most patients and consumers don't realize their data is not shared.
Yeah.
So we can all sit in here and say, okay, well, we'll fix the HRs, we'll fix this, we'll fix that. The truth is, we don't even know how to fix the underlying problem, which is that patients don't know your data is not shared. So maybe academic centers have trouble sharing and patients don't know to share. We're already in a quandary. So, you know, one of the things that we ended up doing, and we do this up at HBS, that we involved the Obama initiative and the Biden initiative, everybody, was we brought in all the direct-to-consumer groups like Rent the Runway and Under Armour and Wayfair and everybody that was using data really wisely to help create that emotion of, I want to give you more data because you're making my life better and you're making something wonderful. And I know it's a stretch to think, well, what are those industries going to teach us in healthcare? But I have to tell you, it was really eye-opening, the importance of having a motive brand, have a reason for being. As they were saying to us, don't talk to us about, you know, data and genomes. Talk to us about why should we be doing this, and let us know that it can make a huge difference. Their own individual data will make their own journeys better. Their aggregated data will help us find cures much faster.
Yep. Okay.
I think there's some interesting contrasts or differences that we still have to overcome, because in an area where the patients are motivated by a cancer diagnosis, for instance, and there is some life expectancy that is very pronounced versus a diagnosis like Parkinson's disease that's happening later in life and is degenerative and progressing, but takes longer. The role that the patient plays is very different. And, you know, one of the things we find is, and importantly, we're eager to be playing, is that we're kind of the trusted source. And so we had to do a lot of educating of Parkinson's patients that they were needed for clinical trials. Mm-hmm. And whether they are observational studies so we could learn more about really what is the complexity of the disease, or in interventional studies, patients had no idea that in Parkinson's, you're lucky to recruit one patient per month per site. So as soon as you shared some of that information, they raised their hand and said, well, tell me where to go. And then you start to realize the classic system, you can't really match up all the people well enough. I mean, we launched a digital platform called Fox Trial Finder, where we do have patients establish profiles, and we do download and contribute our own data about all the trials that are out there. We try to find people so that we can improve that process. But we also know that the current trial or data collections system, particularly around the observational studies, is insufficient, the heterogeneity of the disease, et cetera. And so we kind of complement that with studies that are where patients are just contributing the data. And I think one of the things we find is that a patient-centric group like ours, we understand our disease better than anybody else. And so when you look across these platforms that are trying to do this for every disease, the first thing we found, because a lot of people came to us, is they didn't really understand Parkinson's, and it can't be one size fits all. So I think there's a real opportunity for patient groups to play a critical role to really understand what questions to be asking, to drive some of the ability and create the platforms really for patients to contribute their own data, whether we have a wearables project with Intel, for instance, so you can get the objectively, passively collected data, or let patients answer surveys, but bring this together. I will say, the thing that I think is going to be challenging, and we see this in our world, we've created similar studies to Compass in looking for biomarkers of Parkinson's, and then this patient-reported data type of platforms. We're seeing that industry and the patients are very excited that it exists. And we were kind of the only people to kind of step in and say, somebody needs to do this, let's do it. And we're putting millions and millions of dollars into this every year. Now everybody's like, that data's great, but we can't pay for this forever. I mean, there's a little bit of a tragedy of the commons here, and we have to figure out how to maintain a high quality of data, maintain a clean connection to the patient population that needs to contribute data and wants to benefit from it, but also how are we going to maintain these platforms where scientists all over the world can download data, but these things are very expensive to maintain.
We got shortchanged. We shortchanged the patients on time, but we have a little bit of time left. Let me see if we can. Anybody have a question from the audience to our panelists? If not, I will keep going.
Can I just kick in on this point?
Yep.
That user flow, the workflow of finding a trial, we were talking about this at lunch today, and I can't tell you how many people running trials I've asked, did you start with talking to patients about what they want to have studied?
Right.
And did you ask patients to actually tell you whether the workflow you've designed for them, come into the lab on Thursday afternoon at 3 and do this other thing at home on Saturday night at 10 is actually going to work for them. And I think we're starting to see a real leaning in from folks designing trials to think first about what's a meaningful outcome for patients themselves. I know of one example in Parkinson's where a set of researchers assumed that tremors was a high value outcome to lessen, and when they actually went and talked to the patients, they were like, not really. I care more about sleep. I care more about some of the other lifestyle things. So that's one issue. On this point of finding trials, we had a team of innovators. We have these amazing presidential innovation fellows who went in and worked with NCI and took their pretty kludgy system to publish the cancer trials and made it into an API. And we now have a bunch of different companies, TrialReach and other companies, that are using that to enable really user-friendly tools. So I don't want to say that it's all about APIs, but if we can think of every data sharing thing that we need to do as moving in the direction of machine readable using the technology we already know works on the internet, I think that's going to take us a long way.
Yep. Any questions from the audience?
Just one quick thing. That does take us back to one thing that we all have in common, and I think it hasn't necessarily been addressed quite so much, but there is a pathway that patients go on, and there's always consistent places where they get stuck. And when you said, where am I going? I can't tell you how many hours we spend trying to concierge all the patients to say, I live here, what site am I going to, what doctor am I going to? We also did a publication just looking at when the moment you're diagnosed, like what are the milestones you have to do right as a patient? And it was amazing how many of them hit you right when you're diagnosed. You've got to find the right center. You've got to find the right doctor. You do need to have imaging often done. You do need to know where your tissue is going. You may need to get the genomic testing done. All that's happening right away, and yet not many patients know how to do that. So when you really step back and look at it and go, how do we help the patients? A lot of it is just setting the path for them and making the decision points easy to follow. And it is true, like we have to be able to do it on an app in a way that patients can really figure it out. Yeah. I actually thought one other quick thing that you said was about the funding. And Debbie and I had a conversation just before we were on stage saying, what's the hardest part about running a really great disease-based foundation? And a lot of it is raising the dollars, because you do want to make sure it's coming from all different resources like philanthropy, so that you're not following the money trail of like one pharma company, one biotech, one payer, but instead you're trying to follow how you answer the questions for the patients you serve. And I think that's what tries to set the best nonprofits apart.
The voice of the patient hasn't been expressed enough, so we're just going to let the patients talk. You guys just stay quiet. So we're going to wrap up here. Quick questions. Sean, we talked about, Kathy Hudson mentioned earlier, the issues in data privacy, it's data security.
Sure.
Just in
real
15
quick.
seconds, you feel good about security?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that two things. One, HIPAA is actually fantastic. I went into healthcare, everybody said, well, what about HIPAA? And you look at it, it's a beautiful roadmap for security. It says that the patient has a right to their data. What could be better for a technology company? Now, we take that. I don't actually think it's sufficient, so we do more encryption than what it requires. But the privacy issue is not something to worry about. What you should, in these new technologies, what you should worry about is where all the data has sat for the entire lifetime since the day you went to your first doctor, and how is that being secured? None of the things that we've done in the past was really secure. What we need to do now is think about security holistically.
Claudia, I know Washington all too well. When are you getting your $1 million, and are you funded for the...
So we
Really
have
quickly,
a request to the Congress for $300 million for this year, plus. Congress fully funded this effort last year, and people often ask, what does the transition mean for all these great initiatives? This is a bipartisan issue. Congress showed that last year by fully funding this and plussing up NIH by a lot of money. So I expect any president who's elected next week will see the future of science and invest in it, as well as Congress.
Let's hope so. The patients will let them know. Okay, thank you. Please join me in thanking my panel.